Here's what I thought I would do today. One is I want to take this kind of an opportunity to say thank you and do a little bit of a retrospective, and then sort of look through a variety of things that I've discovered along the way. And I have, no, I'm kidding, but I have a fair number of slides just to show you a bunch of pretty pictures, and I won't dwell on them for too long. I do want to say thank you. I really am grateful to the IPFW community for all the opportunities provided to me and also to my students. It's been really wonderful. Thanks, Mom and Dad. My dad did gently ask me at one point if I might want to be a doctor instead of a herpetologist. But he didn't, didn't push me too much. My thanks to Kathy, my sweetie, who has served me well professionally as well as personally. To my friend Andy and my coffee colleagues who have given me a lot of therapy and liberal arts discussions over coffee and also salmon. And also I wanted to thank Eric Link, for being an inspiration for me in administration and giving me a lot of encouragement and providing me the opportunity to continue doing a lot of the other things that I do. The stuff that I have done over time has cost a lot of money, upwards of about $3 million at this point, chasing these silly creatures around. And that money has come from the federal government, from various state governments, all of the state governments in the Midwest, as well as some more local entities, and also some internal funds from IPFW. But I do want to save my largest thanks for the grad students, some of whom are here today. They are the ones who are doing a vast majority of the data collection, and they are the ones that have allowed me to indulge myself in such a wide array of different sorts of projects over the time. I've been here, I really do have to sit down and figure it out for sure, but I think I've had about 50 graduate students. And in the last 10 years, I counted 22 that have either graduated or that are still in the lab today. So my appreciation to the K team for their support over the time. So to start, I've always been fascinated by wildlife and nature, especially snakes, and I think I wasn't alone in that when I was a kid, but I just never got over it. And I've certainly been asked over the years, why do you study reptiles or why do you study snakes? And for me, at least until late in graduate school, the fact that they were cool, I thought, was plenty enough reason. But at one point, I can remember when I was at a party and I was a doctoral student, and I was just about to finish, and somebody asked me a question like this, and I gave my usual answer, and it didn't quite resonate for me. And that was a moment in time that I think was a bit transformative in that I realized and I wanted to act on the fact that it's not just that they're interesting, but I wanted to do more to protect them. And so a lot of people say, oh, they're icky, or the swamp that they live in is just a mosquito-infested wasteland. Why do you want to protect these things? Well, I think that they're beautiful. And I have begun to pick the Mona Lisa as an example of something that we find beautiful and of value, not only because we could sell it and make a lot of money, but because it has intrinsic value beyond market value. And I look at wildlife and nature in the same way. And snakes are particularly fascinating to me. I definitely think about creatures beyond snakes. We have snakes, turtles, frogs, birds, mammals, wetland habitats, river habitat, etc. So there's a lot of things that I think are wonderful, but snakes actually are pretty fascinating. If you think about the fact that they have no feet and no legs, they can get about in the environment quite nicely. They have wonderful cranial kinetics, that is the mobility of different elements of the skull that allows them to do pretty remarkable things. Here's actually an egg-eating snake, not just a snake eating an egg, but the head is basically like right there. And so it's clearly eating something that's substantially bigger than its head. So that is an amazing feat. And then you have snakes with fangs. Right there. I just have a pair of forceps that I'm lifting the fang out. And now, I don't just free handle venomous snakes and say, hey, look at this. This snake is actually one that's been anesthetized. Actually, in the background there, you can see the surgery tools where I'm going to put a transmitter into this, and you can actually massage the head of the snake and get it to stick the fang out. So it's fascinating that they can do that they can strike a flat surface, at least rattlesnakes can, and inject venom into it, and then they can, if you think about it, then they can close their mouth and not bite themselves. So that's pretty good. And I think their behavior is fascinating. This is actually my favorite species to liven up conversations about snakes. This is a hognose snake. This is actually a species that lives around here. And if you catch it off guard out in the open, it starts to hiss, it puffs up with air, it expands its neck by spreading out the ribs in the neck, and it even strikes, but it doesn't actually open its mouth. It's totally a bluff. It's all for show, trying to scare you away. And if that doesn't work, it dies. It plays possum. It writhes around, and actually you can see the tail is a little out of focus because it's still in the process of dying. It poops all over, the tongue is flailing all over the place. Then eventually it comes to rest, and you can pick it up, and you can hold it, and it'll just hang there because it's dead. But if you put it on the ground and you hold still for a few minutes, it turns around, looks, and then leaves. And the last thing I love to tell about this whole phenomenon is the snake insists on being dead upside down. So if you turn it right side up, it dies again. So I just don't think that's very convincing. So anyway, I do think they can be spectacularly beautiful. Of course, the world around, there's some very, at least in my opinion, very beautiful reptiles, and amphibians, etc. But here's a copper-bellied water snake. This is a federally listed species that I'm the expert on. Blanding's turtle, another species that probably will become federally listed before too long, but it's of interest in the states around here. Some painted turtles. So I really think that they're lovely, and where they live to me is lovely. This is a habitat shot from a helicopter looking at what we might call Mongo Swamp. That's on Pigeon River. Here's a swamp down in northern Kentucky, south of Evansville. This is a forest that doesn't have standing water, but it actually has moist soil, and has plants and such adapted to that sort of thing. And then in town we have the St. Joe River. This is the terminus of Stevie's Island, south of Johnny Appleseed Park, with a great blue heron on it. And that gives me the opportunity to point out too that these habitats that are of interest to me are not just good for snakes or reptiles or something like that. There's a wide diversity of wildlife there that benefit from them. All different sorts of critters are in there, and so it's not just snakes, and there's beauty throughout. And then the other thing I wanted to suggest here is a lot of these animals really need larger landscapes in which to live, and we have to be thinking about preserving not just a pond or something like that, but actually of a landscape. And this is Denali, and I use it not only to suggest a larger scale of beauty, but also it's something, I don't have to go there. I just love to know that it's out there. And so these things are all beautiful to me. But there are, not everyone likes snakes. Here is on the left is a young girl who has been encouraged to shoot this rat snake, and now she's proudly showing it off to her prouder father, I suppose. And then on the right, there's a picture of a rattlesnake that's been killed. And I like this picture because it shows a phenomenon which is frequently used with reptiles and other creatures to suggest that this thing must be about 12 feet long, but actually what the person is doing is holding the snake out well away from his body, closer to the camera, so it makes it look really big. Snake's still certainly several feet long, but not as big as a python. But the point here is that there are lots of detractors and also commercial interests or other sorts of things that are detrimental. And so with the blessing of Susan Hanna way back when, I initiated what I think was the first center of excellence on campus here at IPFW. It was the Center for Reptile and Amphibian Conservation and Management, or the HERP Center for short. And it's also the reason why I've always made a practice of applying what I do in terms of research, but also in terms of engagement with audiences and development of various sorts of materials for conservation. And that lives on in the current iteration is the Environmental Resources Center, the ERC. And you can visit our website at erc.ipfw.edu. I bet shortly it will be erc.pfw.edu. There is a newsletter you can sign up for to hear what goings on we have in the center. Rather than send around a sign-up sheet, I thought I would just gently point out that you can sign up for this, and I'd be happy to sign you up, but I won't make anyone to do it. And through that we engage in a variety of other sorts of activities that, such as the Water Quality Information Service, which is a collaboration between some biologists, computer science folks, faculty and students, and also currently the City of Fort Wayne and the St. Joe River Watershed Initiative and other entities. My idea, my hope, is to do what I can to work on wildlife conservation and also landscape conservation. So there's the address for the Water Quality Information Service, eerily similar, since they're both here at IPFW. And lastly, just to sort of to finish up this background, It's also why I would engage in things like writing of the recovery plan for the copper-bellied water snake, and that sort of application of knowledge. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is just sort of walk you through some of the different kinds of research my students and I have been doing over the years. And there's a couple of tools that we use that we rely on. And one of them has to do with finding a creature that doesn't want to be found, and we need to be able to find it over and over again. Here's a Massasauga periscoping up out of a mammal burrow. I hope you can imagine that these are pretty tough to find over and over again. You have to have some kind of a tool to do that. So here's an example of a box turtle with a transmitter glued on to the back of the shell, and then running off the back, that line is an antenna. So this allows us to find the turtle whenever we want, versus whenever it just happens to be out in the open. Here's Joe Sage. He did a project many years ago on Massasaugas, but he's showing us the use of a radio receiver in his left hand, and the receiving antenna in his right. And that allows us to track these creatures over time. And then here's some data from a box turtle study done where Joanna Gibson and Chris Woodley were involved. And each of the yellow dots is a relocation where a grad student has gone out over the course of several months and relocated this turtle over and over again. And that allows us to start to ask and answer questions about where did they go? How far did they travel? Where are there a concentration of activity? So then we can be able to talk about movements and habitat use and things like that. So an earlier study that I thought was really excellent was conducted with John Rowe and Nathan Herbert as the students, and it was a comparison of the copper-bellied water snake and the northern water snake. Now, the copper-bellied is federally threatened and may be gone from northern Indiana at this point. There's a little relictual population just over the border in Ohio and southern Michigan. But the other species is ubiquitous. It's probably right out here. So it's relatively closely related. It's doing just fine. So why is that? So here is an example of 4 snakes that we tracked for one season at a particular location. There's a scale up there for you. Anything that's green is a non-aquatic sort of habitat, and anything that's blue is some sort of a pond or a wetland or a lake or something like that. And what you should start to see relatively quickly, one more detail. The orange are copper-bellies, and the blue-purple are the northerns. So what should be evident here is that the northerns are just staying on one wetland, while the copper-bellies are traversing a variety of wetlands and also using the uplands around them. And they're using a much larger area. And then we can look at different areas and we can show the same pattern over and over again. They are using larger areas. They are found in terrestrial environments more frequently, and they're using a lot more wetlands. And so over a couple of years, this is a summary of the kinds of things that we discovered. In terms of the number of wetlands used, copper-bellies used twice as many. They shifted 3 times as often from wetland to wetland. The distance that they traveled while doing so was about the same, but the largest moves were actually by the copper-bellies. They tended to use small wetlands far more frequently. And they used temporary seasonal wetlands that didn't hold water all the time much more frequently. They used an order of magnitude more upland habitat. They traveled much farther, and the area that they occupied was also substantially larger. So what we learned by doing this work is that they really do need a much larger area. They need a greater diversity of wetland habitat types and number. And if they lose that diversity, if they run into dangerous barriers in between these different sorts of habitats, they're going to be in trouble. Well, the northerns don't do that, and so they are actually fine. So this helped us discover early on some of the reasons I think really copper bellies were imperiled. So here is actually maybe the first copper belly I tracked. This was back when actually I did a lot of it myself. And this was before I had access to ArcInfo or ArcGIS or all these fancy programs. And so I I found a free government program that I could use to draw habitats, and the little dots are where I saw my snakes. And so this was kind of real early in the game, and I'm putting it there just to reminisce a little bit, but also to show you the other sort of work that the group does that I'm not going to spend too much time on, but I did want to mention it, and that's GIS, Geographic Information System. So if you use Google Maps or something like that, that's GIS. Here's a model taking what we know about the habitat needs of Massasauga rattlesnakes and depicting one kind of model, Mahalanobis model for southern Michigan, and the dark green areas were where we thought they would do better, and it actually aligned quite nicely with where they were found. Here's a draft version of a model that current student Jessica Hinson is working on. This one is for the Blandings turtle in Indiana, and so the darker areas are where we expect them to be, and that seems to be working pretty well. Here's another one that Monica is developing now for pregnant females when they're not hibernating, and that looks pretty good, Monica. Yeah, good. So that's an entirely different thread that we could spend forever on too, but I did want to point that out. Then the other thing that I wanted to mention about telemetry is it affords you this window into to looking at nature that you just would not have. You just would not find these animals very frequently unless you had a device implanted inside of them that ticked, and so you could hear it with a VHF receiver. So here's a Massasauga that's basking. It's kind of interesting, except maybe you can see that there's red dots on its head. And if we look a little closer, and actually, what's that? Mosquito. So who knew that mosquitoes harass poor Massasaugas in the middle of a wetland? But that you start discovering these sorts of things. Here's a big male Massasauga mate guarding a female. So he just wraps around her and tries to keep other males away. And what we do notice over time is that the male keeps getting bigger and bigger, and that's because a bigger, badder dude shows up and pushes the other one off. And but he's guarding her so that he can mate with her. And the outcome is reproduction later in the year. And so here's a mom guarding her kids. And they actually do show at least modest protective behavior for about a week until the babies shed, and then they go on their way. So this has led to other sorts of threads and pathways, and trying to learn about the natural history of the creatures as we track them around. And one of the interesting pathways that we've gone down is hibernation. So this is actually a snake that's coming up out of the ground in the spring. And what they do is they hibernate, at least in many areas to the south, in crayfish burrows. These are crayfish that dig a tunnel down to the water table. They kick out the mud, and if they're active, they look like this. And then when there's no longer a crayfish in there, they last for a while, and there's just like a hole punched in the ground. And this Massasauga has just emerged from that burrow up there. Well, so hibernation occurs in the winter, or overwintering, if we want to be technically correct. And that means that the researchers have to go out there and see what they're doing. So here's Chad snowshoeing around in the middle of the winter, sticking a borescope down into these burrows to try to figure out what they're doing down there and collect other information like what kind of soils are down there, what the water's like, that kind of thing. And a cool discovery there was that the snakes were actually hibernating underwater, and who'd have thought that a snake would do that? But that's exactly what they do. And in the spring, they come up, and actually where they hibernate tends to become wetter and wetter until they emerge. And so there's a snake coming out of a little burrow up in Michigan. Here's one about in the same position, and the white stuff is snow. So they are coming up at about when they, right at that point where if they came out a little bit earlier, they would have to have snowshoes on. But then there's a period in there when it's kind of like it is out there right now, and they're behaving themselves, and then all heck breaks loose, and the students are running around trying to catch their snakes, and all kinds of stuff happens in about a month. We find that they have company, other Massasaugas, garter snakes. Here's a garter snake coming up and just completely surrounded by snow. The garter snakes come out earlier than the Massasaugas do. And this led us to pursue trying to predict when the snakes come out of the ground. So here's some data. I actually have a better set that I'm going to show you in a moment, but this is kind of where we started down this on several different kinds of snakes and turtles, and I want to show you a little bit more data from box turtles. And this is a little bit complicated, I admit, but the thing that I want you to see is that early in this graph, and which is actually the late winter, early spring, the temperatures of areas that are actually further down underground are actually warmer than they are on the surface. So this makes sense. It's cold out there, so the ground is warmer, and that's where the snakes are. Well, how do we know when they come out, or how do we know when the turtles come out? And actually here, the blue going all over the place is the air temperature, so it's cold. But at some point, we see these thermal inversions. So there's one there, and there's one there, and then the black lines are histograms of turtles that have first been noticed to be out on the surface. And so what we know is that this is probably when salamanders come out of the ground. This is actually probably when garter snakes come out of the ground. And then things like Massasaugas and box turtles come out a little bit later when it gets a little bit warmer. The reason that this matters is the red lines are when there were fires that were conducted on these sites. And so in this location, they burned the area after most of the turtles had come out, so there was heavy mortality. And so if you're trying to manage a landscape, you need to know these kinds of things, because you don't want to do that. So, and then the next year, similar sort of thing, but what I want you to notice is that the dotted line is now earlier or to the left on the figure, And if the fire was conducted then there was very little mortality. And so what we have developed in our lab are various sorts of recommendations for how to manage the landscape. So a few more stories here before I completely wear you out. But what I want to talk about now is what we discovered about the connectivity of the landscape. And so I'm okay. I've only been going for 35 minutes. I can go for like 2 more hours now. My timer's lying to me. All right, good. So we learned about the ecology in various sorts of ways, and now we need to also learn about the landscape and the application of that knowledge to help us manage. And one of the things that we noticed with snakes is they don't like roads. So here is a bunch of dots of different shapes. Each different shape with each different color are male and female copper bellies from different years. And what you should notice is that they cluster together, and the snakes from down here never cross this road. In fact, it's very rare for snakes to even cross this road here, although there are some exceptions. Now that road is a gravel road that almost never has any traffic on it. All it is an open area that's maybe about this wide. And so all the snake has to do is crawl over it and it'd be on the other side. Well, they don't want to. That road up there is another gravel road, gets even less traffic, and it's narrower, but it actually has a little bit of habitat closer to it, so that might be why they are willing to cross. This is just a zoom in on that one cluster of observations that was near the road. So they are right next to the road and they're not crossing it. So that can be a problem because that means any old road is going to divide up your habitat. A later study on copper bellies in southern Indiana showed that it's not that they're afraid of people. Here's a nature center. These snakes are probably watching the displays on the inside of the nature center, and they're exploiting this edge, but not crossing over that road. Here's another area a little further south. Again, the different colors represent different individuals. They just don't want to cross that road. And if we zoom in a little bit, we have snakes this is where they hibernate. They're hibernating right next to the road. There's all kinds of observations right along the road, but they don't cross it. So one of the things that happens here is I say, well, they don't cross the road, and then the question from the biologist is, well, how do you show that statistically? Well, that's an interesting challenge, and that's actually something that Monica's working on. Is what you can do is if you have data about the movements and that sort of thing of the snake, then you can apply them to a model that then randomly moves the snake around, and you can apply it then to the landscape. And earlier modeling efforts showed that at least a predicted outcome would be that for copper belly water snakes, they would have much higher mortality on roads than the northerns would. Here, what Monica is looking for is for this particular individual, this is a model of what it might do, and then you can use the red lines or where the potential barriers are, and then you can ask, does the real snake cross the same as the randomly moving model? So that's the way that folks try to get at that these days. Well, there are occasions where we do have individuals crossing. So here's the blue dots are on one side of the road and on the other. And at least in one case here, there's a red dot. So they are crossing the roads a little bit, although there's plenty of roads there you can see where they don't cross. So we did some more research where we actually released snakes next to roads of different surface types, different habitat, and we also did some manipulations with artificial culverts that we made of different widths and that sort of thing, and different substrates. And we discovered that what we think is going on in a situation like this is the canopy comes right over the road, and the road is relatively narrow. They're willing to cross that in a way that they would not be as willing to under other circumstances. And they're willing to go through culverts. They are afraid of small culverts, but if the culvert is big enough, then they'll actually go through it. So this means that it actually, if you want snake, in a place where you want them to cross, you do this. Where you don't want them to cross, you pull the vegetation back, you mow the edges, and you keep the snakes from crossing over. And then you bring the habitat up to the ends of the culverts, and the snakes will go through, and then you'll be able to have the individuals from one side mingle with the individuals from the other side, and your effective population will be much more substantial. All right, so that's how you could manage the landscape. Well, what if the snakes are gone? Well, maybe you need to grow some snakes. So we did some head starting. We've done head starting on several species now. These are our northern water snakes that we're using as a surrogate for the copper belly, because we want to figure this out before we can apply it to the endangered species. And so we actually grew a whole bunch of baby snakes up into small snakes. And so they had very glamorous accommodations in shoe boxes. And then actually we raised them for about 6 months, and then we let them go into the landscape to see how they would do. And we did that at a place called Douglas Woods. And here's what we found in terms of how they grew. Well, so the left hand, this is growth in weight, and this is growth in length. And on the first set of columns are the head-started snakes. They grew very little, and they didn't gain any weight. And then the residents, the next group, did very nicely. We released them when we put transmitters in so we could follow them. We also put transmitters in some of the residents. And we also grabbed some wild snakes from one place somewhere else, and we brought them here and we let them go. And the wild snakes did very well. The head starts did not. And here's survivorship. And what happened, so here's survivorship from starting at 1 to, so everybody's alive, and 0 would be everybody's dead. Initially, the head starts did very well in terms of survivorship, but that was because they never came out of burrows. They stayed afraid in holes in the ground, and so they didn't die, but they didn't grow because they weren't eating anything. And then they were complete failures over the hibernation period, and so then most of them died by spring, and then not long after that, all of them were gone. The snakes that we translocated didn't do very well either, although this included snakes that just left. So that's considered a failure because they're not adding to your population if they're not there. But those that made it to winter made it all the way through, and then the rest of them died or they left. We actually found out later that some of the ones that left came back, so they actually survived the winter. They went off and found somewhere to make it, and then they came back. So what do we do differently? Well, let's raise them until they're a little bigger. We'll enrich their environment. So we give them places to bask. We give them food, but now they have to chase after the food. So this is enrichment. How does that work? Well, we also did a brumation, which is where you kind of cool them down and let them overwinter for a little while to simulate the off season, and then you start feeding them everything again And here's what we found then. So now we have 3 treatments. There's the residents, which are the circles, the enriched environment that I just showed you, and then the tub snakes are snakes where we just kept them in the shoe boxes for the whole time. And what we discovered is actually they all did pretty well. And it would appear that if we hold the snakes a little bit longer, if we emulate an overwintering period to let them set their clock, perhaps, that actually we could raise some snakes and let them go, and they would be okay. But where do you put them? Well, there's various ways of doing what you call a soft release. You put them into an environment that you hold them where they are, or you do a hard release where you just let them go into the environment. And the observation, even at what you saw with the resident water snakes, everyone's looking at the clock. Come on, man, I got like 5 more minutes. So so there's a soft release versus the hard release. Well, one notion for a soft release was to actually make a hibernation site and put the snakes in there. So then they would have to start the active season sort of locked in place because they're not going to go anywhere during the winter. So this actually meant going out with talk about a post hole digger, out there in the woods and digging burrows into the ground. And this actually did not work. But we did put in snakes that appear to be rather naive, and so I think the jury's still out on this. More recently, Jill is working on looking at putting Massasaugas that are wild caught and putting them into a new location inside of an enclosure. So here's a aluminum-sided enclosure. You hold them in there for a couple of weeks, and then you open up the doors and let them go out, or if they don't cooperate, you put them out. But you don't want to do that because you want them to do everything of their own volition. So we've looked at the basic ecology. We've run down various sorts of threads in terms of finding out about their needs and that sort of thing. We've looked into how to manage the habitat. We've looked into what if we make the habitat well, but the snakes aren't there anymore? Then maybe we would figure out how to put them back. So some conclusions from all that. Well, and I put question mark because I just rambled around all over the place. So I'm not really, there isn't a particular take home I have for you today. But it's been an interesting ride. Very many interesting discoveries along the way. I really do appreciate the help and support of all those around me. And the conservation message would be that the wildlife and the landscapes they live in are under threat all the time. And to protect them, we do need to understand them, which is what we were busy doing. And in my opinion, the work that I do is the most valuable if I actually get out and try to implement change and have an effect. And the only way that I'm going to be able to do that is through outreach and community engagement and that sort of thing. So that's been a large part of what I have done ever since I started here. And there's still a lot of beauty out there, a lot of cool-looking creatures, and we can go on striving to protect them. So we have that to look forward to. The other thing that I wanted to say again is to come back to the students. That I'm very proud of a legacy that I will leave, which is the students that I've touched. Sometimes they might feel ignored because there's been a lot, but I have in fact purposefully strived to have a lot of them at any particular time so that they can all try to work together, they can build their own community and network. And I think that's been successful. But certainly, I just started looking back, just actually starting last night, thinking backwards about what sort of professors and such that have come through my lab, what sort of state and federal biologists, or even in some cases Indian nation biologists, and there's even a dentist. So, and I do think there's close to 50 folks now, and Jessica helped me construct this map this morning. And what this shows is the red dots are where my students have come from. So they come to IPFW not because they were actually here as undergraduates usually, although sometimes. Sometimes they go back to where they came from. Sometimes they go somewhere different. But I do notice that a lot of them actually settle in the Midwest and frequently in Indiana. And so I'm contributing to the educated resources that we have in the region. So with that, I will say thank you and see if you have any questions for me.
So I'm pretty interested in the enriched environments for the snakes because there's a lot of research in psychology that shows that enriched environments for rats has neural consequences in time. Have you or anybody else looked at what the enriched environment does to whatever kind of brain the snake has?
We have not. What we did at our level was would they survive? Would they eat? Would they gain weight? Would they find a place to overwinter? Would they survive into the following year? And we would take that as evidence that they were coping. What we have discovered is that what we have done, it's the jury's out in terms of whether it did have an effect. But that kind of stuff would be very interesting. But the budget, I think, to work on snakes is probably smaller than the budget to work on rats. So we have to do what we can. But yeah,
Bruce, as far as predators go, do they feed on each other in general, or not?
Well, that really varies depending on what kind of critter you're talking about. For most of these, for most animals, a lot of times it's you'll eat whatever you can, whatever won't try to get away, and that's small enough. For example, a mouse, which is an herbivore or a granivore, is going to be very happy to eat a cricket if it got its hands on it. So I say that just for one thing because I think it's kind of cool. But for another, these things are in fluctuation and flux all the time. But under most circumstances, I would say no. There are snakes that are specialized to eat other snakes. But the copperbellies are actually frog specialists. They'll eat fish if you give them a fish, but what they really mostly eat are tadpoles and frogs. The other species eats frogs and snakes. The turtle will actually eat probably anything that'll hold still for long enough for it to swallow, but berries and insects and snails and all kinds of things like that. No more questions? Yeah, Jim.
I just found it fascinating that you discovered they were overwintering underwater. Are they in a static state? Do they come up to breathe, or are they just slowed down that much?
Yeah, it depends. So that I thought that was so wonderfully cool when I found that out. And I actually was not the first person to see that. There was work that was done on garter snakes where the researcher thought that might be happening, and so he had them overwinter by crawling down into water that was near freezing, and could actually show that they were down there and they never came up. But that's in really oxygenated water. When the water is depleted of oxygen, like you would have in a crayfish burrow, what they do is they form a ball actually this far down underground, so the water's like that, and then periodically they'll just come up and take a breath. but because their metabolism is temperature dependent, they don't have to do that very frequently. And there was one time when we were studying a population of water snakes down by Henderson, Kentucky, and this was in 97, the flood. Remember the flood in 97 where the Ohio River was miles and miles wide, dwarfing what happened this year. The water level where the snakes were overwintering was the height of this ceiling. And so everyone is saying, well, your snakes are dead. And I said, well, I don't think so, because if they live here, they're probably adapted to make it. And then 2 weeks later, the water level came down and the snakes were out. And the snakes were definitely not out during that 2-week period of flooding because the water was moving. So if you have water that's almost freezing, moving, there's no way that a snake's going to go up, get a breath, and go back to the burrow that it had. We were in boats listening to them from on top of the water. So it's pretty cool. Yeah.
Bruce, you mentioned that the snakes, they like the wider culverts, but they're afraid of the more narrow ones. And I'm curious if you have made any assumptions about why that is, because I would think if they're used to burrowing, that they're used to small spaces. So I'm not able to figure that out.
Sure. Well, I think what they would do with a narrow culvert is they might enter it and use it, just the very beginning of it, as a refuge. So they're happy to do that. What they're not willing to do is travel from here over to there through something this big. I think they want to see where they're going, and they're actually, if you think about the natural history of a snake, they're not used to doing this. Like, I think I'll crawl through this tube now and go over there. And so instead, you have to think of them as navigating a challenging landscape, and it's big enough where they feel it's something natural. And I think that's actually what's going on.
Bruce, in a lot of your slides, you showed the concentration of these snakes very close to the roads. And is this because the food source is normally there also?
That's a great observation. There's two reasons that I think we see that. One is because a lot of times right next to the road there actually is something attractive. The roads are kept clear. They could be mowed, so the snake gets on the shoulder, not where it's being mowed, but just to the side. It has access to sun. There are a lot of prey like those areas, and a lot of times there'll be a ditch there. So the snakes have access to the water and to the prey. The other thing that happens is that the snakes come through the landscape and they hit the barrier, and then they move like this. So you get a lot of movement, and so you build up a lot of observations there until one sort of pops over and gets to the other side. So that's the other reason that you see that.
What is the source of metabolic energy or fuel while they hibernate?
Well, it would be the same as for us or for any other organism, just basic like a fat metabolism. It's just at a very, very low rate. They weigh the same at the end of hibernation as they do at the beginning because they've used so little fat. So it's mostly about, it actually is adaptive for them because they come out in good condition. They don't come out of hibernation in poor condition. And so that helps them when they get first going. Sherry?
Is your research being used at all to impact the overhang of plants and the size of culverts?
Yeah, there's actually been quite a few things that have been picked up because of the work we've done. One of the constraints here at the university is that the master students are only around for 2 or 3 years, and then they go off and do some other wonderful things. And so some of the work, unfortunately, has not gotten published, and so is not necessarily out in the general literature. But that doesn't mean that the land managers and folks like that haven't gotten the message. So we've been responsible for helping drive macro and micro topography that gets used in restoration of wetlands. Land managers actually do adjust some of what they do to manage the edge of roads and are trying to make decisions about targeting some areas to discourage or encourage movements. They are incorporating what we found out about overwintering in terms of when they do various sorts of practices like prescribed fire and disking the soil and that sort of thing. So actually quite a few things over the years have actually been implemented, and that's been really gratifying. Eric?
Bruce, so not so much about snakes necessarily, but more about your ERC work. And specifically, if you got a chance to write policy for Fort Wayne, what does Fort Wayne need to be doing better right now?
So, so actually that makes me think about a riverfront development downtown, and there are three pillars of that were proposed. One of them was economic development. Another one was recreation, and the third was protection of the environment, with the focus really on things like water quality. You know, most people are yet not that concerned with how the water snakes are doing or something like that, but that leads to an overarching thought about how to approach quality of life and the landscape in and around Fort Wayne. And what we see is we have these green spaces that are juxtaposed throughout. An obvious one would be a park, but there's a lot of other green spaces that are less developed. And what we need to do is connect those. And then a real clear ribbon of habitat are the rivers. And what we need to do is protect the riparian areas that are around those rivers, and then look for ways to connect these different landscape units that are of value to wildlife by having additional corridors. And so my recommendation as far as that goes is to preserve what natural space we have and then look for ways to connect them. Some creatures are going to have a hard time getting from one thing to another. Even with some birds that can fly, they're just not willing to go across certain kinds of landscape. But what we discover is that there are otters in Fort Wayne, there are fox, coyotes. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if there were an occasional bobcat. And they go through the landscape. We don't even see that they're there, but we actually know that they're there. One of these days, I'm going to get somebody excited enough to let me put a collar on some of them so I can track them in town. But that's the sort of recommendation that I would make, is that we have a limited amount of natural environment for them, and we need to maximize the utility of that so that the creatures can get around.